In a recent video, I looked at a couple of common errors that I see in my developmental editing work, and today I'm going to look at a couple more that are probably just as common. The first one can crop up in any kind of story. It's something that I see all the time and that I do all the time. It's all about the repetition of a certain type of word in quick succession. This one happens most often when you're writing at pace. You're in your flow state, paragraph after paragraph. This is definitely a first draft problem and one that you can easily pick up in editing, and I'll show you a quick trick to help with that in a bit. While this error isn't limited to only this certain type of word, I tend to find it pops up the most when we're using pronouns. I refer to it as pronoun paralysis. Here's an example from the first draft of the book I'm working on right now, Project Ventus. It's not blatant, it's not hugely obvious, but once you notice, you notice. She scanned the ad for the part that specifically stated she'd be alone on the island but couldn't see it. She went over the conversation she'd had with Juliet, which now seemed different, tinged with motives of a different shade than before. She couldn't remember a time when she'd actually said, "You'll be on the island alone." It's not egregious, but there's 3 sentences in that passage, and they all begin with she. It doesn't affect how clear the passage is, or the pace of it, or the meaning of it, which is probably why it's so easy to not notice you're making this mistake. But what I think it does affect is how the passage feels. It makes the writing feel repetitive and less interesting than it should be, and that's not because of the content of the sentences, it's because of the structure of them. I'm no psychologist, obviously, but maybe there's something in the fact that they all start with the same word, so maybe the brain just classifies them all as the same kind of thing, something like that. What this error also does is draw the reader's attention to the fact that they're reading a story. 3 sentences back to back, all beginning with the same word, it just feels kind of artificial in some way. It's quite stop-start, so the passage doesn't flow, and that's what I think makes it stand out a little bit. To fix this, we don't have to eliminate all the pronouns in the paragraph. It's not about that. We just want to create the opposite of that stop-start effect. We want to make things a little bit smoother. Here's a version 2, which I think flows much better. I'll read it and then I'll talk about what I changed. Karina perched on the side of the bed and scanned the ad for the part that specifically stated she would be alone on the island, but couldn't see it. She went over the conversation she'd had with Juliet, which now seemed different, tinged with motives of a different shade than before. Had there been a specific moment where she'd actually said, "You will be on the island alone"? The obvious change here is I've amended 2 out of the 3 pronouns. The first one I just changed to the character's name. Now, this isn't a guaranteed way to fix this issue because you can fall into making the same mistake with just using your character's name over and over again instead of a pronoun. However, this is at the beginning of a paragraph, so it feels like a more natural place to refer to your character by name. It's kind of an anchor for the reader. It makes clear who they're looking at so that what follows is easy to understand. The middle one I left exactly as is because, like I said before, we don't need to get rid of all of them because we're not targeting pronouns, we're targeting repetition. Then lastly, I've reframed that final statement of "she couldn't remember a time" into a question. Had there been a specific moment? The variation in sentence framing or sentence structure, whatever you want to call it, I think helps with the flow of the paragraph. It makes it a little bit more engaging and a little bit more interesting. Of course, there's plenty of ways I could have fixed this or added to this paragraph or changed things, but this is just to demonstrate how you can approach this one error. Like I said before, this is a fairly common error in third-person writing, but it's a real killer in first person. My first novel was in first person, and the amount of paragraphs that just went I, it's a really easy trap to fall into. What can also help to remember is that whether you're in third or first or second even, you don't have to constantly refer to your story through your character's eyes or frame it in that way. Like my last sentence, you can ask a question without having it come directly from the character, or you can add in description without involving the character necessarily. As a very quick example, instead of saying "she came around the corner and saw a beautiful waterfall," you could just say "around the corner was a beautiful waterfall." Let's recap. It's easy to fall into pronoun paralysis, especially when you're writing quickly. To avoid it, try starting your paragraph with your character's name, if it makes sense to do so. Remember that you don't have to get rid of all the pronouns, just focus on the ones that are back to back and are more noticeable. And reframing sentences is a great way to add a bit of variation and make your paragraphs flow a bit better. I just want to take a few seconds to remind you about the developmental editing service that I run on my website. If you've got a piece of a novel or some short fiction that you really would like some feedback on, check out the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen. Right, back to the video. I mentioned an easy way to check for this repetition. it's just Control and F. But if you put she or I with a space after it, it'll highlight all of the occurrences and you can see how close together they are, and if they're back to back really clearly. Makes it way easier when you're editing. The next mistake is a bit more technical, and it's all about mind reading. Sort of. This is something I find crops up quite a lot in third-person perspective, specifically third-person limited. And the word limited here doesn't mean it's a pretty basic perspective, kind of mid, not all that useful. It means limited to one character, specifically the mind of one character. We can hear their thoughts, know their opinions and their feelings. We can write stuff like, he felt embarrassed or she felt angry, because we know that. However, we cannot then do the same thing for other characters because, understandably, when you think about it, it would get really confusing for readers. They wouldn't really know who they're supposed to be siding with or following along with. Here's an example, again from my book. We're following my character Richard Strauss as he talks to an old acquaintance who's been foolishly meddling in his life. This is a kind of mock-up version to illustrate the mistake. "It was all you," Strauss said, his irritation catching up with him. "Your influence, your meddling that put me here." "Oh, Richard, I had no idea. I thought it was just..." Mr. Lawrence fell silent. The truth was hitting him. He realised how far he'd overstretched into Strauss's life, only to ultimately make it worse. All those nights in his old house, without his wife, without his job, angry at everything, it had all been for him really, for himself. He'd been trying to make up for old wrongs. So, can you see the error here? We're with Strauss, we know he's irritated because we're in his third-person limited perspective. Then we move to Mr. Lawrence, but we also see how he feels. We see the truth landing on him, and we're even privy to some of his memories or his thought process. And if we were writing in third-person omniscient perspective, whereby the narrator knows the ins and outs of everyone's minds and thoughts and opinions, then this would be absolutely fine. But we're not. We're in third-person limited perspective, so Strauss shouldn't know these things about Mr. Lawrence, so we shouldn't be seeing them here. Or at least, we shouldn't be seeing them presented as facts. Because although we shouldn't have access to another character's thoughts and feelings, we can still make assumptions and observations about them through the eyes of the character that we're actually following. So with that in mind, here's something more like what I actually wrote, staying within the bounds of third-person limited and following Strauss. "It was all you," Strauss said. "Your influence, your meddling that put me here." "Oh, Richard, I had no idea. I thought it was just..." Mr. Lawrence fell silent. Strauss could see it landing. He watched it on his old teacher's face, the recognition of how far he'd overstretched into Strauss's life, only to ultimately make it worse. Strauss imagined him alone in his old house, without his wife, without his old job, rattling around, picking up the phone and taking out his anger on someone else. None of it for Strauss, not really. All of it for himself, to make up for old wrongs. The big difference here is that Strauss, and by extension the reader, is now making assumptions and observations only. Because Strauss is with him, we can observe the recognition on Mr. Lawrence's face, or we can assume that that expression is recognition. Rather than knowing it for a fact, we're assuming how he feels. Then we're imagining what his sad evenings alone in his house might look like. And they're no longer memories, they're assumptions. And I don't think that weakens these images or makes them any less real. Because we're following Strauss in his third-person limited perspective, we're going to assume what he assumes. We're going to trust his judgment. The difference between these two versions is that now all of that meaning and all of those details are coming from what Strauss can observe and assume about Mr. Lawrence. That keeps us firmly in the bounds of third-person limited without taking a confusing detour into the mind of a whole other character. Let's recap. If you're writing in third-person limited, which is most third-person writing really, you can't be zooming off and exploring another character's mind. Instead, what we need to do is present the information about that other character framed through the assumptions and observations of the character that we're actually following. So let your character make educated guesses. That way you avoid confusing the reader and making him think, hang on, who am I supposed to be following here? Both of these errors, like all mistakes, are really easy to make, but luckily they're pretty easy to fix as well. The hardest part is spotting them. To find out about a couple more errors that could be lurking in your manuscript, watch this video next. Thank you so much for watching as always, and happy writing.